have you ever wondered about something strange in the global economy? Every day, countries around the world exchange real goods, resources, and services. China manufactures products, the Middle East supplies energy, Germany builds advanced automobiles, Japan develops cutting-edge technology. Millions of people contribute their labor, resources, and expertise to create things with real value. Yet, when international trade is completed, many countries receive something in return: the US dollar, a currency issued by the United States. At first glance, this seems like a normal financial transaction. But if we look deeper, a much bigger question appears. Why does the world accept a currency created by one country? Why do nations store dollars in their central banks? Why do governments purchase US Treasury bonds? Why do companies around the world use dollars for international trade? And why has the dollar become the most important currency in the global economy? The surprising part is not only that countries use dollars, it is that they actively want to hold them. Central banks keep dollar reserves. Financial institutions trade dollar assets. Governments purchase US government debt. The dollar has become much more than America's national currency. It has become one of the foundations of the global economic system. So how did a currency created by one country become the money used by the entire world? Is it simply because the United States became powerful? Or is there a deeper reason behind the dollar's global position? To answer this question, we need to return to a time when the dollar was not the center of the world. Because contrary to popular belief, the dollar was not born as the world's currency. It had to earn that position. When the United States first created the dollar, it was simply the currency of a young nation in North America. At that time, the currency that dominated global trade was not the dollar. It was the British pound. During the 19th century, the British Empire was the most powerful economic force in the world. It possessed the world's largest naval power, a vast colonial network, and one of the most advanced industrial economies of its time. British goods were sold across continents. British ships connected global markets. British banks financed international trade, and London became the financial center of the world. If a country wanted to purchase British machinery, import resources from overseas, or borrow money from international markets, it often had to use the British pound. But the world did not use the pound because the currency itself had some special magic. A banknote is only a piece of paper. The pound became powerful because of what existed behind it. Behind the British pound was a global trade network, a powerful financial system, industrial strength, and the military influence of the British Empire. This reveals one of the most important principles of global currencies. A currency does not become dominant because it looks valuable. It becomes dominant because the country behind it can provide something the world needs. In the 19th century, Britain could provide that. The United States could not. The dollar was still only a regional currency, but history was about to create a turning point. Two world wars would completely reshape the global balance of economic power. Before the United States could become the world's financial center, the old order had to be transformed. And that transformation began with the First World War. The First World War, the rise of America's economic power. When the First World War broke out in 1914, European countries suddenly faced an enormous demand for resources. They needed food, steel, oil, weapons, and industrial supplies. But at the same time, the war was destroying the very foundation of European production. Factories were damaged, farmland was destroyed, workers were sent to the battlefield. The countries fighting the war were consuming resources faster than they could produce them. As the war continued, Europe began looking across the Atlantic to the United States. American factories were far away from the battlefield. They were not being destroyed. Instead, they were producing goods at an unprecedented scale. European countries began purchasing massive amounts of supplies from America. But there was one problem. They did not have enough money to pay for everything. So European nations began selling overseas assets. They borrowed money from American banks. They transferred gold reserves to the United States. The longer the war continued, the more Europe depended financially on America. By the end of the First World War, the economic relationship between Europe and America had changed dramatically. For decades, Britain and other European powers had been major lenders to the world. Now, the United States had become one of the world's largest creditor nations. But the First World War was only the beginning. The Second World War would accelerate this transformation. The Second World War, America's industrial advantage when the Second World War began. History repeated itself. Large parts of Europe and Asia suffered enormous destruction. Factories were destroyed. Cities were devastated. Industrial production collapsed. But the United States faced a completely different situation. Protected by two oceans, the American mainland remained largely untouched by the war. Instead of being destroyed, American industry expanded rapidly. Factories across the United States began producing on an enormous scale. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, steel, fuel, food. The entire American economy became a massive industrial engine supporting the war effort. While other countries were using their resources to survive the war, the United States was building something much more powerful: industrial capacity, technological capability, financial strength, and global influence. When the Second World War finally ended, the world looked completely different. Europe was exhausted. Britain was carrying enormous debts. Germany and Japan had suffered catastrophic destruction. But the United States emerged stronger than ever. It possessed the world's most powerful industrial economy, advanced manufacturing capabilities, and a large share of the world's official gold reserves. The center of global economic power began moving. From London to Washington and New York, the British pound had dominated the previous century, but the foundations of that dominance were weakening. A new era was beginning, the era of the US dollar. However, becoming the world's largest economy was not enough. A country does not automatically gain the world's trust in its currency, simply because it becomes powerful. The United States still needed to create something much bigger: a new global financial system. A system that could rebuild the world after war. A system that could make international trade possible. A system where the dollar could become the foundation of global finance. And that moment arrived in 1944, at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The rise of the dollar was no longer just about American economic strength. The United States needed to design a new international order. An order that would determine the future of global money. In the summer of 1944, while the Second World War was still being fought, leaders from around the world gathered to design the economic order that would follow the war. They knew one thing: the old international financial system had failed. The world needed a new foundation. In July 1944, representatives from more than 40 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States. Their mission was to answer one critical question. After the war, what currency should the world use for international trade? The world had already experienced the consequences of a broken monetary system. Between the First and Second World Wars, many countries repeatedly devalued their currencies. They hoped cheaper currencies would make their exports more competitive. They tried to protect their own economies by restricting imports. But instead of creating stability, these actions created currency conflicts, trade barriers, and deeper economic tensions. The world needed a new financial order, a system that could encourage trade, reduce uncertainty, and prevent countries from using currencies as economic weapons. The solution created at Bretton Woods was built around one central idea: the dollar would be linked to gold. Other major currencies would maintain fixed exchange rates against the dollar. Under this system, the United States made an important promise. Foreign governments and central banks could exchange their dollar reserves for gold at a fixed price. This gave the dollar something unique. It had two layers of credibility. The first layer, gold, a physical asset with limited supply. The second layer, the economic strength and credibility of the United States. For many countries, holding dollars was almost like indirectly holding gold. But the dollar had one major advantage over gold: convenience. Gold is valuable, but gold is heavy. It is difficult to transport. It is slow to settle, and it is not practical for supporting a rapidly expanding global economy. The dollar was different. It could move through banking systems. It could be used for international payments. It could support loans, investments, and financial markets. Slowly, the dollar became the central medium of international trade and finance. But the rise of the dollar was not only about gold. After the war, the United States also helped rebuild the global economy. International institutions were created: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other organizations designed to support economic recovery and stability. The United States also launched programs such as the Marshall Plan, providing financial assistance and resources to help rebuild Europe. And here, something important happened. Europe needed American machinery, American food, American energy, but Europe did not have enough dollars. So the United States provided dollars through aid, loans, and investment. Europe then used those dollars to purchase American products, repay debts, and rebuild its economy. As a result, dollars began flowing into countries around the world. They entered banks, businesses, and financial systems. A global payment network was slowly being created. At first, countries used the dollar because it could be converted into gold. But over time, they continued using the dollar because everyone else was already using it. And this created one of the most powerful forces in economics: the network effect. To understand this, imagine you are a Japanese company. You need to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. Then you sell automobiles to customers in Europe. You could try to complete every transaction using Japanese yen. But there is a problem. Saudi Arabia may not want to hold yen. European customers may not want to pay in yen. If every country used a different currency, international trade would become extremely complicated. Companies would constantly exchange currencies. They would face exchange rate risks. They would pay higher transaction costs. The simplest solution is to use one currency that everyone accepts. The dollar became that currency. Oil exporters accepted dollars. European banks held dollars. Japanese companies could borrow dollars. Global commodity markets increasingly use dollars for pricing and settlement. Two countries that might not trust each other's currencies did not need to trust each other's money. They only needed to trust the dollar. This is the true power of a global currency, not just value, but connection. The more people use a currency, the more useful it becomes. The more useful it becomes, the more people choose to use it. And as more people use it, a larger financial ecosystem grows around it. Banks, bond markets, foreign exchange systems, insurance, and payment networks. Eventually, people were no longer using the dollar only because they trusted the United States. They were using it because everyone around them was already using it. The dollar became like a global language. English is not necessarily the perfect language in every situation, but when international contracts, scientific research, business negotiations, and technical information are already written in English, new participants have a strong incentive to learn it. Because the true value of a language is not just the language itself, it is the number of people you can communicate with through it. The dollar works the same way. Its strength comes from the global network built around it. However, this growing system contained a hidden problem. The world economy was expanding. Countries needed more and more dollars. To provide enough global liquidity, the United States had to continue sending dollars overseas. It could do this through imports, foreign investment, international lending, or persistent trade deficits. But there was a fundamental contradiction. The amount of dollars in circulation kept increasing, while America's gold reserves were limited. If every country suddenly demanded to exchange its dollars for gold, the United States would not have enough gold to fulfill all those promises. The system that made the dollar powerful was beginning to create its greatest challenge. The world needed more dollars. But every dollar still carried a promise: gold. And eventually, the United States would face a difficult choice: continue protecting the link between the dollar and gold, or abandon gold completely. That decision would change the global monetary system forever. In the previous chapter, we saw how the dollar became the foundation of the global financial system. But becoming the world's money created a new problem. The more the world used dollars, the more dollars the United States had to provide. And under the Bretton Woods system, every dollar carried a promise. It could be exchanged for gold. So, a new question emerged. What happens when the world needs more dollars than America has gold? The Bretton Woods system gave the dollar something unique: a direct connection to gold. But that same connection would eventually become the system's biggest weakness. As global trade expanded, the world needed more and more dollars. Countries needed dollars to buy goods. Companies needed dollars to conduct international business. Financial markets needed dollars to support global investment. To satisfy this demand, the United States had to keep supplying dollars to the world. It could do this by importing more goods, investing overseas, providing international loans, or running long-term trade deficits. But a contradiction was growing. The world had more and more dollars. Yet, America's gold reserves were limited. Under the Bretton Woods system, countries trusted the dollar because they believed those dollars could ultimately be converted into gold. But what would happen if the amount of dollars in circulation became much larger than America's gold reserves? By the 1960s, some countries began questioning whether the United States had issued more dollars than it could actually support with gold. Confidence in the system began weakening. Several countries started reducing their dollar holdings. Others requested to exchange their dollars for gold. As a result, gold began flowing out of the United States. Then came a historic moment. In 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. This decision ended the most important foundation of the Bretton Woods system. From that moment, the dollar was no longer a promise to exchange paper money for a fixed amount of gold. The dollar became a true fiat currency, a currency whose value depends primarily on trust. Trust in the issuing country, trust in its economy, trust in its institutions. At first glance, this should have been a disaster. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, why would the world continue using it? Why would countries continue holding it? Why would the dollar not collapse? The answer is simple: because by that time, the dollar had already become much more than a substitute for gold. It had become the infrastructure of the global economy. International trade was conducted in dollars. Global banks provided dollar loans. Companies issued bonds denominated in dollars. Central banks around the world held dollar reserves. Oil and many other commodities were priced and settled in dollars. The world had spent decades building an enormous financial network around the dollar. Contracts, bank accounts, debt relationships, payment systems, investment markets. If a country suddenly abandoned the dollar, it would not simply be changing one currency for another. It would need to rebuild an entire economic system. It would have to redesign trade agreements, banking systems, foreign exchange reserves, debt markets, and commodity settlement mechanisms. The cost would be enormous. This is why the dollar survived the loss of gold, because the foundation of the dollar had changed. At first, gold helped the dollar enter the global system. But later, the global system itself became the reason the dollar remained dominant. Gold opened the door. The financial network kept the dollar inside. And this reveals one of the most important ideas about money. A currency's power does not only come from what backs it, it also comes from how many people depend on it. But this raises another important question. Does the dollar's global position mean the United States can create unlimited money and buy anything it wants? In some ways, the international role of the dollar gives the United States enormous advantages. America can use its own currency to purchase goods from other countries. The US government can borrow more easily because its debt is issued in dollars. And during global crises, investors often move toward dollar assets. This gives the United States a financing advantage that few countries can match. But this does not mean the United States can create unlimited dollars without consequences. Because money can be created, but real wealth cannot. Oil cannot be printed. It must be extracted from the earth. Food cannot be printed. It must be grown. Semiconductors cannot be printed. They require advanced technology and manufacturing. Buildings cannot be printed. They require materials, workers, and time. If the supply of dollars grows much faster than the supply of real goods and services, the result can still be inflation, higher asset prices, and a decline in purchasing power. The foundation of the dollar is not the printing press. The foundation of the dollar is confidence. If the world begins to believe that dollar assets can no longer preserve value or that the United States is no longer able to maintain the stability of the system, countries will gradually look for alternatives, so America's advantage is not unlimited money creation. It is something closer to a massive global credit advantage, a privilege built over the past century through industrial strength, technological leadership, financial markets, political institutions, and a worldwide economic network. The United States can use this advantage, but it can also misuse it. Now, we can return to the original question. Why does the world accept the dollar? Because what the world accepts has never been just a piece of paper. Behind the dollar is the scale of the American economy, globally influential companies, advanced technology, one of the deepest financial markets in the world, U.S. Treasury securities, global banking networks, international payment systems, and decades of contracts and financial relationships. The dollar survived the loss of gold, but the reason it survived was not because gold was no longer important. It was because something even more powerful had already formed around it, a global financial system. And over generations, countries around the world have built their economies around the dollar. They price goods in dollars, they borrow in dollars, they save in dollars, they settle international transactions in dollars. The dollar is no longer simply America's national currency. It has become part of the infrastructure of the global economy, a shared system for measuring value, settling payments, and connecting markets. This system is not perfect, and it will not necessarily last forever. History shows that no monetary system remains unchanged forever. But replacing the dollar requires something extraordinary. A new system would need to be large enough, stable enough, liquid enough, and trusted by enough countries around the world. Until such an alternative appears, the dollar will remain extremely difficult to replace. The true power of the dollar does not come from a printing machine. It comes from a cycle. People accept the dollar because others accept the dollar. Countries hold dollars because global trade requires dollars. They hold dollar assets because those assets provide security and liquidity. And because so many people use the dollar, even more people are encouraged to continue using it. This is the real secret behind the dollar. The United States did not simply create a currency. It built a global financial ecosystem around it. America creates dollars, but the world created a system that gives those dollars value. And that leads to another important question. If the dollar has become the world's most important currency, who controls the supply of dollars? The answer lies in the institution responsible for managing the dollar system, the Federal Reserve. Because the dollar is both America's national currency and the world's primary international currency, the decisions made by the Federal Reserve affect not only the United States, but the entire global economy. When the United States makes monetary decisions, it mainly considers American inflation, American employment, and American economic growth. But because the dollar is used by the entire world, those decisions do not stay inside America. They influence exchange rates, global debt, housing markets, stock markets, and capital flows around the world. When the United States expands dollar liquidity, money can flow into global markets. When the United States tightens monetary policy, capital can quickly return to America. A decision made in Washington can influence financial markets and economies around the world. And this creates the next major question. Why can a decision made by the Federal Reserve affect billions of people outside the United States? That is where the next chapter begins. In the previous chapter, we saw how the dollar survived the end of the gold standard. But after gold was removed, the dollar system changed completely. The value of the dollar no longer came from a promise to exchange it for gold. Instead, it depended on something much larger, a global financial system built around the dollar. And at the center of this system stands one institution, the Federal Reserve. So the next question is, why can a decision made by the Federal Reserve in Washington affect economies around the world? The reason is simple. The dollar is no longer just America's currency. It has become the foundation of the global financial system. And when one currency becomes the center of global finance, the decisions that affect that currency can influence the entire world. When the Federal Reserve changes interest rates, it is not only affecting the American economy. Its decisions can influence exchange rates, global debt markets, housing prices, stock markets, and the movement of capital around the world. Why? Because the dollar sits at the center of global finance. For decades, companies, banks, and governments around the world have borrowed, invested, and traded using dollars. A company in another country may earn revenue in its own currency, but its debt may be denominated in dollars. A developing country may need dollars to purchase oil, technology, or industrial equipment. International investors may hold dollar assets as part of their portfolios. As long as dollars remain widely available, this system can function smoothly. Businesses can borrow, investments can expand. International trade can continue. But when the United States changes its monetary policy, the entire system can shift. Imagine the Federal Reserve raises interest rates. Suddenly, U.S. Treasury bonds and other dollar assets become more attractive. Investors around the world begin asking, why take additional risks elsewhere when I can earn higher returns from relatively safer dollar assets? So capital begins flowing back toward the United States. Money leaves some emerging markets. Their currencies may weaken. Their dollar-denominated debts become more expensive. Import costs rise. Financial pressure increases. For countries with large amounts of dollar debt, a stronger dollar can become a serious challenge because they must use more of their own currency to repay the same amount of dollars. A debt that seemed manageable yesterday can become much heavier tomorrow. This is why a decision made inside the Federal Reserve building in Washington can create consequences around the world. A change in U.S. interest rates can influence businesses in Asia, governments in Latin America, commodity markets in Africa, and investors everywhere. But this does not mean the United States directly controls every country. The deeper reason is structural. The world has built a financial system around the dollar. And when one currency becomes the center of global trade and finance, the decisions of its issuer naturally spread throughout the system. Economists often describe this process as the dollar cycle. When the United States lowers interest rates, borrowing dollars becomes cheaper. Global liquidity increases. Investors search for higher returns. Capital flows into emerging markets. Asset prices rise. Economic activity accelerates. But when the Federal Reserve raises rates, the cycle can reverse. Dollar liquidity becomes tighter. Investors become more cautious. Capital flows back toward the United States. Countries that depended on cheap dollars suddenly face pressure. This cycle has happened many times throughout modern history. And every time, the world is reminded of the same reality. The dollar is not just a currency. It is a global financial system. However, this system creates a difficult dilemma. The Federal Reserve has a responsibility to manage the U.S. economy. It must consider inflation, employment, and economic growth. But because the dollar is used by the entire world, its decisions create consequences far beyond America's borders. This is the unique position of the United States. It issues the world's most important currency. But the world also depends on the decisions made by its central bank. This creates a deeper question. If another country wants to challenge the dollar, what would it actually take? Because replacing the dollar is not simply about creating another currency. It requires building an entirely new global financial system, a system with trust, liquidity, deep financial markets, stable institutions, and a worldwide network of users. The Federal Reserve does not control every economy in the world, but because the dollar sits at the center of global finance, its decisions can create effects far beyond America's borders. And this leads to the next question. Could another currency ever replace the dollar? In the previous chapter, we explored why the Federal Reserve has such a powerful influence on the global financial system. But the power of the dollar creates another important question. Could any other currency replace the dollar one day? To answer this question, we first need to understand one important fact. A global currency is not simply a currency with a high value. A currency becomes global only when an entire system develops around it. A country that wants its currency to replace the dollar must provide much more than money. It needs a large economy, a stable political environment, deep financial markets, trusted institutions, open access to capital, and a global network of users. In other words, the world does not choose a global currency only because it is convenient. It chooses a currency because it trusts the entire system behind it. Could the euro replace the dollar? Let's start with the euro. The euro is one of the world's most important currencies. The European Union has a massive economy. It has advanced industries, wealthy consumers, and strong financial institutions. So why has the euro not replaced the dollar? The challenge is that Europe does not have a single unified financial and political system. Different countries share the same currency, but they have different governments, different fiscal policies, and different economic priorities. A global reserve currency must provide confidence during uncertain times. Investors need to know that large amounts of money can move safely and freely. But Europe's financial system remains divided among many different countries. The euro has global influence, but it has not created the same level of unified financial infrastructure as the dollar. Could the Chinese yuan replace the dollar? Now consider the Chinese yuan. China has become one of the largest economies in the world. It is the world's largest manufacturing center. It plays a central role in global trade. Naturally, many people ask, could the yuan eventually replace the dollar? China has already taken steps to internationalize its currency. More countries are using the yuan for trade settlements. China has expanded currency swap agreements. It has developed alternative payment systems, and it has encouraged greater international use of the yuan. But becoming a global reserve currency requires more than trade. A country must also provide a financial market where global investors are willing to store enormous amounts of wealth. Investors need to know, can they freely move their money? Can they easily buy and sell assets? Can they trust the rules? Can their investments remain protected over decades? This is where the yuan still faces challenges. China's financial system remains more controlled compared with the dollar system. Capital movement is more restricted, and global investors still have questions about long-term access and predictability. China has enormous economic strength, but creating a global currency requires more than manufacturing power or trade volume. It requires a financial system that the world is willing to fully trust. What about gold? For thousands of years, gold has been considered a symbol of wealth and security. Unlike government currencies, gold cannot simply be created at will. Its supply is limited. During periods of uncertainty, investors often turn to gold as a safe store of value. But gold has a fundamental limitation. It is excellent for preserving wealth, but it is not efficient as a modern global payment system. Gold is heavy, difficult to transport, difficult to divide, difficult to use for billions of daily transactions. The modern economy requires speed, liquidity, and a sophisticated financial network. Gold cannot easily provide these things. Could Bitcoin replace the dollar? What about Bitcoin? Bitcoin was created with the ambition of becoming a global alternative monetary system. It has several unique characteristics: a limited supply, a decentralized network, no single institution controlling its issuance. For many supporters, Bitcoin represents a different vision of money, a system that does not depend on any government. But becoming the world's dominant currency requires more than technological innovation. A global currency must support international trade, government reserves, corporate finance, banking systems, and billions of transactions. Bitcoin is still developing in these areas. Its price volatility, regulatory uncertainty, and limited integration with traditional financial systems remain significant challenges. So does this mean the dollar will never be replaced? Not necessarily. History shows that no currency remains dominant forever. The British pound once ruled the global economy. But over time, Britain's economic position weakened, while the United States built a stronger industrial and financial system. Eventually, the dollar replaced the pound. The same principle applies today. The dollar will not lose its position simply because another currency exists. A replacement must provide something better. Not just a different currency, but a better global system. A system with the same level of trust, the same financial depth, the same liquidity, the same global accessibility, and the same network effects. The reason the dollar remains powerful is not because every country loves it. It is because the entire world has built an enormous economic structure around it. Replacing the dollar means rebuilding that structure. And that is one of the hardest challenges in the global economy. So the real question is not which currency is better. The real question is, which country can provide the world with a financial system powerful enough, stable enough, and trusted enough to replace the dollar? For now, the answer remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. The future of the global monetary system will shape the future balance of economic power. Previous chapter, we explored whether any currency could replace the dollar. But even if no immediate challenger exists, the dollar system still faces important questions. After decades at the center of global finance, one final question remains. Will the dollar system continue forever? Or will the world eventually move toward a different monetary order? The answer is not simple. Because the strength of the dollar does not come from a single factor. It comes from many different elements working together. The dollar's power comes from the size of the US economy, the depth of American financial markets, the global influence of American companies, technological leadership, institutional stability, military capability, and most importantly, the enormous network that has been built around the dollar over the past century. But every system has weaknesses. The dollar system is no exception, and one of its biggest challenges comes from the same factor that made it powerful. The world depends on it. Because the dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, global demand for dollars remains extremely high. Countries need dollars for trade. Companies need dollars for financing. Financial institutions need dollars for stability. This gives the United States a unique advantage. The US government can borrow at lower costs than most countries. American companies can access global capital more easily. And during times of uncertainty, money often flows toward dollar assets. But this advantage also creates responsibility. The world needs a steady supply of dollars. That means the United States must allow dollars to flow into the global economy through trade deficits, international investment, and financial markets. But here lies a long-term challenge. The world needs more dollars, yet too many dollars can weaken confidence in the currency. This tension has existed inside the dollar system for decades. If the United States manages this balance carefully, the dollar can continue to play a central role. But if confidence in the system gradually declines, the global monetary order could begin to change. Not necessarily through a sudden collapse, more likely through a gradual transition. Countries may diversify their foreign exchange reserves. Businesses may use multiple currencies for international transactions. New technologies may create alternative financial systems. However, history shows that dominant currencies rarely disappear overnight. The British pound did not lose its global position in a single moment. Its decline happened gradually as Britain's economic strength weakened and another financial system became stronger. The same principle applies to the dollar. The dollar will not lose its position simply because another currency exists. A replacement must become more trusted, more convenient, more liquid, and more widely used. The world does not replace a currency. It replaces a system. And that brings us back to the beginning of this story. Why can America create dollars, and why does the world accept them? Because the world is not accepting paper. It is accepting a system. A system built over more than 100 years. A system connecting global trade, financial markets, government reserves, international debt, and everyday transactions. The power of the dollar does not come from the ink on a banknote. It comes from the invisible network behind it. The factories, the banks, the contracts, the institutions, the markets, the trust. A piece of paper itself has almost no value. But when billions of people, millions of companies, and governments around the world build their economic activities around that piece of paper, it becomes something completely different. It becomes infrastructure. This is the true secret behind the dollar. The United States did not simply create a currency. It created a global financial ecosystem. And once the world became connected to that ecosystem, leaving it became extremely difficult. But there is one final paradox. The dollar gives the United States extraordinary power. At the same time, that power creates extraordinary responsibility. Because when one country's currency becomes the foundation of the global economy, the decisions made by that country affect everyone else. The dollar is not just America's money. It is the world's most important financial language. The dollar system has survived wars, financial crises, and major changes in the global economy. Its strength does not come from money itself. It comes from the system built around it: economic power, financial markets, global trade, institutions, and decades of trust. And as long as the world continues speaking that language, the dollar will remain at the center of global finance. But history tells us one thing: no monetary system lasts forever. The dollar may remain at the center of global finance for many years, but the future of money will depend on how the world changes. This is the story of the dollar system.